Good day, all. Welcome to the Powerhouse Perspective, empowering leaders for business breakthroughs. If you haven't joined us previously, I'm Scott Medeiros, president of Helmwise, and this is Chandler Rose, the CEO of the Rosewood family of companies. Over the past 5 podcasts, we've covered a variety of different subjects and areas. We started out with knowing yourself. We've been using the C metaphor, so we call the individual who leads a business a captain. So knowing yourself as a captain of a ship or of a business. We also talked about knowing the ship or the organization. We've talked about the importance of values and the need to have a North Star to guide your ship to its destination. We've also talked about analyzing your crew along with yourself to see if there's any gaps between where you currently are and where you want to go. And we also been kind of transitioning into making decisions. But when we make decisions, there are a lot of things that we have to consider. And there's a subject that we want to talk about today before we embark on our very first journey towards our first destination. And that subject is neurochemistry, because neurochemistry affects how we think, how we perceive things, how we analyze things, and more importantly, how do we make decisions. So Chandler has had an extensive amount of background in this particular area. He's going to walk us through a learning and understanding of how neurochemistry can make us better captains and better leaders of our organization. So Chandler, where would you like to start?
Well, the basic premise is, and the reason I've been involved in that, so studied psychology in undergrad, started with Cialdini, and then have continued to follow it throughout my career because I want to make sure that I understand what factors I may not consider that influence how I make a decision. And so am I actually making a decision that is wise and well thought out? And so that goes beyond the data in front of you, goes beyond, even talking with your team, talking with those around you. And there are things internally that impact how you make a decision, the amount of research you're willing to do into a decision, really how you weigh that out. And so it's important to understand that and where that can hinder or help in kind of decision-making process. So when you think about it, we're going to narrow down really and focus on dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin.
The big three.
The big three for sure. And so serotonin is one that I like to start with. And so there's a book we have here in front of us that I think does a great job of laying that out. And that's the Science of Positivity. And so that is Loretta Bruning, PhD. She put this book out a while back. It's certainly one I would suggest you read. And she goes through and lays out on the premise of a lot of these chemicals have evolved over time like humans, and they really played a very important role when we were in nature, out in the wild, or play a big role in your background in the military of survival. And so a lot of chemicals in your brain that were geared to keep us alive, to draw us towards grouping as a species, reproduction, safety, gathering food, all those things can get a little bit sideways when they move into the modern world. Because in the modern world, we are not faced with daily threats that are literally going to impede our ability to find a mate in the wild. Right. And so imagine being out in the wilderness. Most of us are not imminently going to be killed. There are places, of course, in the world that we should consider and be empathetic to that have that going on. Ukraine and places like that across Africa and other places where this is a daily concern. How do I get water? How do I stay safe? Those chemicals are really good for that. In a society where we can order food, we are very safe on a whole. They can cause some problems. And so when we run down those big three of serotonin, where I like to start, like I said, oxytocin and dopamine. There is a fourth that is a big impact on us, and that's cortisol. And so it interplays with the big three. And so those kind of push back and forth. So serotonin I start with because that is really weighing out your decisions. And so serotonin, we naturally don't want to get injured. That makes sense. Right. We want to survive.
Right.
And so when we are presented with any opportunity, your brain quickly, without you even processing it in your prefrontal cortex, says, in my past or in my quick estimation, am I likely to get injured or hurt or not succeed pursuing this opportunity? And so what they're finding out, at least in the more recent stuff I've read, is they look at a lot of the pharmaceuticals that help people that have a lot of anxiety. Is serotonin does kind of split into two pieces. So it is it going to be a negative result or neutral or positive?
Positive. Okay.
And so there's actually two sides on that serotonin. And the reason that I say it's first, and I think that that's pretty accurate from what I've read and watched, is even if you imagine in the wild we were going to get some food, you and I were close, but we were both hungry. The first calculation, we think it would be dopamine to seek and go grab it, which we'll cover later. But in reality, it is a real quick calculation of whether I can get it without Scott injuring me. And so, am I faster, more persuasive, stronger, better fighter? Your brain is doing that regardless. And so, if you don't think that's true, consider the last time you went to a social event and you walked in the room and you immediately, no matter how much you think you don't rate yourself, you rated yourself. You walked in the room and you looked around and you thought, hey,
Already
what are they
comparing.
wearing? Yeah, we're comparing. And so
Yes.
your brain automatically is going good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. That's important to understand, and we'll talk a little further when you get in decision making why that's important, because we don't have that fear of death that is imminent most of the time.
Right.
And so is that fear warranted in this situation, or are there other factors that may overcome that fear? So that's one area where serotonin comes in, and we'll probably circle back around with that. So we see this opportunity in front of us. We weigh it out. We decide odds are it's an odds maker. It's a better. It bets.
Okay.
And so the odds maker says we can go for it. Dopamine kicks in. And so dopamine is a very powerful drug that a lot of your narcotics, a lot of your, I think it is great the work that Andrew Huberman has done. So if you all are going to look at the podcast to learn more about dopamine, he is running a podcast on bringing science to the masses. And so he covers a wide variety of topics, but dopamine is certainly one. And we'll reference him because he is a few different times, because he is really doing a good job of gathering all the more recent studies, bringing them together into something that's more digestible, although some of his are longer than our ramblings. They go on for 2 or 3 hours because they're extremely complex. So if I trip up on one of my references, feel free to go visit him. He does it all day at Stanford as a neuroscience professor.
Well, I think you've watched many of those Huberman videos several times, because they are information dense, and you've got to watch them a couple of times to kind of tease out or discern out those important things. And what I think so interesting about this whole subject of neurochemistry is what you're bringing forward. This is happening automatically. And so it's not very often that we are aware or conscious that this is happening in our brain. But as good leaders, if we understand the neurochemistry side of things, we actually can use it to our advantage to make better decisions. We can probably fight off some of those natural tendencies because we are aware of what's happening even unconsciously in our brain chemistry. So this is a great, interesting subject. I'm sure our viewers are probably going, why are we on this neurochemistry? I thought this was a business kind of framework, business discussion sort of podcast. And it's because it's so important to be aware of what's happening in our mind when we're making decisions. Because the more that we're aware, the better we can combat and the better decisions we can make.
Well, it certainly is. And it's, as a leader, once you make that calculation, which you hope you have calculated properly, and you decide to go forward, that dopamine level is really what
right. So the
drives.
serotonin, the odds maker says it's worth it.
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
Right.
And so we can get into more detail on what can influence those levers and how it weighs out the odds. But the dopamine is then what they call a seeking. A lot of people for a long time thought that it was a reward-driven chemical that was released in your brain. Studying rats, they thought that the rat hit the lever, dopamine went up because it wanted the actual food. And so you can do some research online and find out more info on that. But the reality was the rat really was getting the dopamine on the anticipation of this pressing the lever will lead to food. And so why is this important? Because you get people in your organization and you get in the habit of setting your final goal, either your waypoint could be a 1-year goal, a 3-year goal, could be a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. That in your mind, you start creating as that is the ultimate success. And so if you read a lot on growth mindsets, another book out there on that, really what you want to realign your dopamine on is focusing on anytime you make positive steps or momentum towards a goal that you find worthy. So that's a tie into our why, our purpose,
Right.
setting a really smart goal out there that is, maybe an intermediate goal, but you can break that down, and anything that moves you towards that. And if you recognize it, we talk about gap versus gain. And so the way that works is, if you're focused only on the pinnacle achievement, you will miss all the gain in between. And so your dopamine gets trained to a final peak, grasping at a goal.
Okay.
Downside of that is you're more likely to quit, and you're less likely to have joy on the way there. And then the third kind of downside of that is most of the time in your mind you've hyped your goal so much that when you get there, your natural downside of dopamine being released
disappointment, disillusionment, that sort of thing.
It is a much more steep drop
Right.
and a potentially deeper drop because you have built up. I think Huberman gives an example of meals. So I know this: you eat at a nice restaurant, but if you hype it up to all your friends, it's going to be the best ever. I've eaten here so many times, best ever. You go in there and it doesn't quite meet the mark. Huge disappointment.
Right.
And so the gap versus gain analogy was your child. You're going to bring your child some candy. Well, instead you told your child you're going to bring them Snickers, and you failed to deliver the Snickers, so you supplement it with something else. What does the child immediately do? They become disappointed because they didn't get the Snickers.
They didn't get the Snickers, exactly right.
If you had said it as,
became a bit lower.
Hey, I'm going to get you a surprise, or I'm going to get some candy, so that they are getting a gain. Any gain would have been a positive impact on the child, and so they have set a trigger that's a little bit off of kilter. So that's why dopamine is an important one. Dopamine is also regulated a lot as comparison to what we talked about in the past of pain. And so the pain versus pleasure principle.
Yeah, we talked about that principle, yes.
And so dopamine, if you imagine, which we'll cover a lot more later, your natural kind of growth of a career. We talked about seasonality. You grow towards a goal, you get it. You have to do hard work, and you get the next goal. You have to do hard work to get the next goal. Well, one of the things about dopamine is if you don't go through that down cycle, it limits how high up the upside is. And so there is a correlation between the pain and the release of dopamine. And so people that say, well, why don't you just give me the answer? Why don't you do this for me? Well, in reality, you're lowering how much they get out of the actual journey and the growth that they have involved. So it's a tough thing to do as a parent, tough thing to do as a leader, is you want to give them enough clarity and information, and you know this by talking with your developing people below you, if you're a manager, if you're a president, whatever it is, even if you're working with teammates. You want to give them enough so that they can succeed, but you want them to feel self-worth of they went through the hard work to actually accomplish it.
Right. So that old adage, give a man a fish or teach a man a fish scenario, right? You're going to do them much more positive benefit by teaching them to fish because they go through some of that trial and adversity than you were just giving them the fish or giving them the answer.
Right. And the reward is higher because they know they worked hard to achieve it. And so you know intuitively when you receive something that you didn't work hard, you kind of get a bad feeling like maybe I'm not worthy of receiving this. And so that's when you have got to consider whether you put in the hard work necessary or if it was truly a gift, something you should be grateful for.
Correct.
One way to kind of stop that downward slide is immediately think of what you're going to do with that gift. So sort of a pay it forward. So instead of you really going, I didn't do enough for this, how am I going to take this? And obviously it fits with our ProVantage and Helmwise and all the Rosewood Company Live Multiply Your Blessing. Take this thing that was given to you, whether you earned it or not, and make something better as a way to kind of offset that dip afterwards.
Yeah, so after that receipt of that gift, you would naturally get a slight decline. But if you start thinking about it, how can I use this? It's now the seeking chemical. Dopamine kicks in again and takes you more upward trajectory.
Yep, take this item and I'm
So
going
it's
to
the
seek
fact
a
that
way
you're
to
now
move it forward.
seeking something else.
Yeah, and so the cortisol kicks in after every time we metabolize, or something
Okay.
happens, and it is kind of a warning sign. But that's not always. So there's a couple of different ways you can impact that dopamine. There's several ways to make it go up, a couple of ways to make it less impactful. Kind of the downside potentially, but I think it's great for leaders. Certainly has led to the human species discovering new things, developing new things. Is it is a one-time maximum hit. So if you repeat the same item over and over again without breaking the cycle, the level of reward of dopamine chemically actually goes down. And so if you think of it back to the goal setting, if you're not constantly looking for the next way to raise the bar or move to the next goal, and you want to stay static on I'm just keep getting this same reward, it's good enough.
Right.
I've heard that saying, good enough. Well, one of the things you see out of people that are good enough people is that a lot of times generalizes out into the other types of work because they've started lowering down their dopamine, and then they need to go really face something that is a little more challenging and move it up and get that hit back up a little higher.
So is that one of the reasons that employees become disenfranchised in an organization if they keep doing the same thing, making the widget every single time, because it's that repetition? In reality, the dopamine levels aren't increasing, and therefore that's causing them to become disillusioned?
It is largely, and that's why setting goals, doing I would almost call it gamification of how you reward factors and different things. It's important to add on or have secondary rewards that go on to especially repetitious type work. And so you can, one, raise the bar, two, create other competitions, other reward systems, other things to kind of tie into that. So they are getting new, even though the actual work is repetitive. So they have a new pursuit.
Well, they can make a personal best, right?
They can do a personal best, or
last month I'm going to get,
they could lower the number of errors in a run of something on an assembly line. There's a lot of ways to move that forward, but the repetition does lower the impact. Now, one way to bring it back. So if you've had cake every day for a while, cake is not good anymore. I think that most people understand if you take a break from cake and come back, you can actually get that hit again. And so that's intermittent rewards, which is a big impact subject we could probably spend a whole other session on, but certainly is a big deal when you're a business leader. Is we love structured reward systems. We love tiered reward systems that you do X, you'll get Y. We do these awards on a certain cadence because they're easy to plan around. In reality, they are not nearly the most powerful reward system, and that is more of the intermittent rewards, which are similar to gambling, similar to you find people who love, I always laugh, fishing, golf, the bring you back shot you've heard in golf.
Yes.
The bring you back shot is I hit it 120 times a day because I'm terrible, but then I hit one really good, and it was amazing.
Right.
So then you go back, you play 12 of 18 holes, you're frustrated, hole 13 goes great, you're like, this is amazing, I'm going to go do it again.
Greatest game ever.
Greatest game, fishing, hunting, there's lots of outdoor activities mainly that guys do. Shopping, I found the best deal. You found the best deal is I've been looking all over and randomly I came across a great deal. You won't believe it. Well, the random reward system is much more of a driver. And so a lot of this, we view it and go, why is that so? Well, think about out in nature if we were back into we'll go back 1,000 years. And so we exhaust, if you exhaust a supply of food, this is where you go, and you don't go seek new things, then you end up running out and you could starve. And so they push for new ways. We did get a lot better when we moved, obviously, to agrarian society where we could farm, but then we also had to set goals again to keep us moving forward, so that repetitive can be very dangerous also, because if you think of animals in nature, if they get in a habit, what's likely to happen? They'll get eaten. So there is a drive to move forward and to try new things. And so there's a lot of examples that are out there you can look at on why that's important.
You mentioned the benefit of intermittent or time in between doing certain tasks, where you can get the fact that you haven't done it for a while, the eating cake scenario, you then get another good hit of dopamine. Is the research that you've read, or have you found any period of time that needs to happen between one and the other?
So the period of time your brain is actually pretty smart. So if you set a period of time, it knows you set a
Oh,
period of time.
okay.
And so there is a pretty
So it's that randomness that you just spoke about a
yeah.
minute ago.
Once you structure it, you have then eliminated randomness.
Interesting.
So Huberman, I'll give a shout out to him as well. He even advocated potentially flipping a coin. And so even if you did set a cadence to potentially do something, flip a coin to get the random yes, no of whether you're going to get
Got
it or
it.
not. And so
Wow.
you're introducing it in between, maybe another way to trick the brain into taking a little different approach.
Yeah. So you triggered a lot of things in my mind about, because we do this in business. We have things at set intervals.
Yep.
Whether they're a weekly meeting, whether it is a QBR, they're at these intervals. And not that, that interval is the only detriment to learning there, but you have to start thinking, how is this affecting the brain? And so this is why we bring up neurochemistry into this particular podcast, is because it's so important to becoming a better leader. And so the more we know, the better decision makers we can be.
Well, let's circle back on the leadership part of the pain versus pleasure. And in this sense, we're talking about the amount of work necessary to reach that satisfaction of dopamine. So that also carries over to what I mentioned is you see it obviously in drugs. Most people understand. You've heard that you'll never get the same high as the first high.
Ooh.
But I don't think that what the studies have shown most people realize is that also works to, a spoiled child syndrome. And it also is seeming to work a lot into the addiction to devices of, I need a hit, I'll flip to another show. I'll watch another funny film. I'll watch
Right.
Chive all day or whatever
There
your
you go, yes.
whatever your
TikTok
people are great
videos.
or people are awesome. So we'll just watch it,
Yes.
watch it, and it starts losing its impact and its positivity. What we're doing is not only lowering the dopamine because of the repetitive nature. When you don't have the pain, you're actually lowering your baseline. So if we make an artificial baseline of 10 instead of 0, if you go through a pain and gain scenario, you get the hit that's good,
Okay.
and you get a slight increase in your baseline.
Okay.
You go on another pain and you go for the next peak, which takes you through another valley to the next peak. You get a refreshed big hit of dopamine, and you get a slight bump in baseline. And so you can build this up over time. And so it has limits, of course, but it will build up. The real part of the no pain part that is bad is you actually start taking it from a 10 downward. And so if you continually engage in items that you do not have to go through any hard work to get it, or any pain, or any amount of suffering, whatever you want to call it, training, learning, studying, we just give you the info. We give you the fish.
Sure.
You don't, not only do you get less dopamine on the upside, you start lowering your baseline. And so then what I've noticed even in my young children is they watch enough iPad, especially when they were very young, they would watch other kids play with toys they had and wouldn't even have the desire to get off of the device and play with their own toy they had the toy that kid was receiving joy. So they got the hit. They didn't have to play the game. They didn't have to set up the game, find another child to play
Right.
with, which is
Sure.
an oxytocin discussion, which we'll move to that in a minute. But they didn't have to do any of that. They just got to watch the reward of opening the prize, getting the win. Well, eventually that baseline lowers so much they won't even do the things they enjoy. And so there are two things there that, we're not giving them enough pain to get full potential of their dopamine, and
Right.
we are potentially also lowering their baseline dopamine and joy and when I use joy, lots of definitions, you want to go and look at it, but I compare joy and happiness to the difference in weather and climate. And so joy, I take more of a climate. So how is your overall mood? How are you closer to fulfillment, and kind of how your overall state is? Happiness, I analogize much more to the daily weather. It can be rainy. Does that mean that you have a rainy disposition? Those are not the same. And so that's what I talk about when I'm comparing the two. So why does this matter as a leader? It matters a ton. It is your job to weigh out options, your job to keep yourself motivated, your job to lay out options clearly and make sure your people below you are considering all the options, your job to set up situations where they can build their motivation and their self-esteem and their confidence. And so these are areas that you impact as a leader. The third one that we have in there that we hadn't talked about much is oxytocin. And so that is the desire to herd. And
Herd.
So, yeah, we want to group. We want to group together. You know, what's better than one of us is two of us. And so, if you find someone else you have commonality with, either purpose, similarity, and you have a shared togetherness, you get a little hit of this is good. It's a positive chemical, makes you feel good. Conversely, you know, if you think of animals, if you watch National Geographic out in a herd, one of them gets off to the side. That bad feeling is the cortisol that we hadn't spent much time on kicking in, going, hey, wait a minute, I need to get back in this group. So it serves a great purpose if you're a gazelle or antelope out on the plains or Cape buffalo of, hey, stay with your group, stay with your group. Also works well, as we talked about, as, you know, back in caveman days, a lot easier to stay alive when there are a group of them together as opposed to individuals. Right. And so safety, defense, again, reproduction, food gathering, you share that load, and so that's important. In business, why is this important? Should be obvious unless you have a single sole proprietor operation. You need teamwork.
Right.
And so how do you build teamwork? How do you build up oxytocin events? How do you build up the desire to bond? And so you need to be aware of the need to create environments where they can work together. You know, studies have shown the best way to really build bonding among groups that may be either contentious or just don't know each other or maybe different backgrounds is to get a shared goal where you both have to work together to fix something or accomplish something. So not just a social event, not just bring them together and let's hang out. You actually have a pursuit. So kind of take that back. It's a group example of the dopamine cycle. So together, Scott and I need to come up with a way to launch Helmwise, do these podcasts. What are we going to work on? So we have together started through the pain cycle back up. So we're getting a hit of both of those, and it builds that team effort together. So again, it's important as a leader to build events where you're working with your team, important to get your team to work together. So that's a big impact on oxytocin.
So oxytocin is the herding, dopamine is the seeking, and serotonin is the sort of the odds maker.
Correct.
Right? I was reading a book by Simon Sinek. It was called Leaders Eat Last. And he talks about those chemicals. At least he talks about dopamine, serotonin. He talks about oxytocin. And he referred to them as selfish and selfless chemicals. What are your thoughts about that? He thinks serotonin and oxytocin are selfless, maybe because it has that people component to it. Whereas dopamine and the other chemical that he covered at that time was endorphins. Those are selfish because it was all about the individual. Is that what you've seen in some of your research as well?
No, I would have to differ slightly.
That's the reason I brought it up.
So I would differ slightly because I'll give you kind of a very good example, you know, or different examples of how that would potentially play out. And so, again, this is a reason I think it's so important to make sure that we pursue a worthy why and we have what I would call noble values, good values, because in us, these things are always playing. And so if serotonin's out there, we think the odds are bad or we think we could get injured, we get that cortisol hits. It feels bad. Well, when something feels bad, if we feel we don't have oxytocin away from the group, cortisol also kicks in. If things are too good, too calm, and you feel bad. And so another area as a leader you need to be real careful is
you're not working hard enough.
Yeah. Do you really feel that, or is that just your animal brain saying, wait a minute, things are not going so, they're calm. You need to take a little time to be grateful, show some praise, find some other things to do. But back to your question on whether it's selfish or not, dopamine is also a hit, like I said, when we are seeking new ways to do things with a purpose in mind. And so when you have a good why out there and you're doing it within a set of values you have imposed on yourself and you have expressed out in the public to be held against, and the public being put them in writing, shared them with your team, shared them within your company, and you're willing to self-impose those on you, that dopamine drive is actually for us to fulfill our shared purpose. Yes, you want your personal purpose to align with the shared purpose because it builds, consistency and authentic leaders. But I don't think dopamine has driven scientists, astronauts, explorers, doctors. It would be, I think, a overly optimistic view to think they did that just for society. But
Right.
I also think, on the other hand, part of their reward and part of their teams that they assembled to go Shackelford going to
Shackleton. Mm-hmm.
Shackleton, going to on his polar adventures, it was still a group,
Yeah.
and dopamine was a huge driver. The purported advertisement that you're not likely to return,
That's
whether
right.
that's true or not.
Yes. Yeah. Very.
Obviously,
Very
if you
famous.
think you're not likely to return, that was kind of a self-fulfilling. So I don't disagree with that part. But when you align that with a purpose that is what I would consider kind of worthy, then you're able to move the needle pretty heavily in the right direction. Serotonin, I'm half and half on that one. Serotonin also is why you walk in the room and you think you're better than everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so why you go to buy nicer clothes, why you sometimes go to the gym to look better than the other person, which is can be ego, can always go all the way back to being an animal, wanting to be able to mate.
Yeah.
So there is a ranking, and so serotonin is another one. Your brain is going to rank no matter what. And so I think it is funny, and it is actually in this book when you see the capitalism, chasing money, all these things, that's what creates this desire to rank and to be better. No, that's been there. It's in your brain, in your chemicals, in animals' chemicals, not just humans, to rank all the time. And I don't think we're going to be able to, well, the way it works in your brain, that calculations happen before you even thought about it. So your prefrontal cortex hasn't kicked in. Now you can override it through a good direction, but so let's take that ranking. So what do you do when you're always looking around the room and you are ranking? You're ranking no matter whether you want to admit it or not. Again, good personal values, a good purpose in your life is, hey, let's rank towards something that's actually good. Like let's pursue let's do a blood drive, let's do a food collection, let's do the trick there is it doesn't take long to where it does become selfish, because then you superimpose or swap out from I like the Indiana Jones where he swaps out
The idol for the sand.
idol for the
sand.
bag of sand. Well, it is very tempting as a leader, as a captain we're pursuing this worthy goal. I want to, Toys for Tots, name the charity. And then all of a sudden it stopped being the charity and it's about your ego of, I want the reward. It became an I.
Right.
And so
Right.
serotonin, I would argue, can pretty quickly make you as selfish as dopamine can. And so when that ranking system moves from survival, safety, pursuit of things that aren't going to harm you, pursuit of things that are good, to uh, narcissistic, sociopathic type of
Sure.
ranking and moving yourself up, it's pretty easy to swap that out.
So we hear a lot about business. There's a lot at times they compare business to sports, team oriented nature. You need a quarterback, you've got to commit to the team, those sort of things. And we also know what drives athletes is competition. So is competition really kind of a serotonin hit because the competition is the ranking that they're doing against somebody else?
You trigger an influence that is a lot more than the three chemicals. I mean, certainly if you go and run down, uh, watch Huberman, read a lot of the data that's out there, studies that are out there, it would be really nice and simplistic to say serotonin plays a big part in love, which it does. But this is coming from your brain, not so much from your gut, and there's a lot of technical parts of that. Competition, the pursuit of that, your real reward in competition, I think what sports teach you is will you kind of overcome that ranking that says you might not make it? And so if you think of your ultimate high, you set a goal, a big, hairy, audacious goal is, it's called audacious and hairy because if you actually did a odds maker calculation in your brain on serotonin, you would probably say, I'm not going to make
I'm
it.
not going to make it. Yeah.
So then you cross over into areas that I know neuroscientists and people don't like to acknowledge as faith, although they can measure faith's impact on increasing your willingness to embark on those adventures, increasing your neuroplasticity. They can see the impacts of it. There's a lot of debates. I'll let everybody else get into how faith, we certainly covered as important. That's not necessarily just religious faith. That's faith in a cause, faith in
Faith
a
in
family
people.
member, faith in a teammate, somebody who you have oxytocin with that you joined up with. So faith to me is when you make that calculation, you're not sure of the outcome, and you step out into the unknown. And so I think sports plays a lot into that. Certainly sports is playing on hard work. There's a lot of practice. Everybody thinks that, having played some sports in the college and then known a lot of people that went and played at the professional level, it's not Sunday and game time. It's the bazillion hours, no different than the military you put into food, sleep, nutrition, diet, training, the whole 9 yards. So there is a big amount of pain that goes into that success that they're pursuing. Also, obviously, sports is a intermittent reward. So you play the game because you're not sure who's going to win. So obviously, that's why you get excited about winning, is not just all that. So you mix a lot of things together. It's a confluence of different items that come in on sports and how those chemicals play out.
Yeah, it sounds that a lot of things that we've talked about in the earlier podcasts, having a North Star or a why, setting a BHAG. We talk about the importance of teamwork and communicating with your team and getting alignment and orientation. In reality, when I start thinking about those actions, there's actually a trace back to each of these chemicals, right? And those things are important because it triggers those chemicals in the brain. And that's why it's important. Everyone says, well, we must have a why, we must have a North Star. Well, the reason we need the why of the North Star is because of these chemicals in our brain that are going to motivate us to move forward, to embark on that journey, to buy in, to go through pain, all of those other elements of that cycle. And so that's why I think it's so interesting in business is that we go out there, we find the latest book, we find the latest framework, and we say we need to do these things. But we don't understand the underlying cause on why we're doing those things. Easy to say, but why does it work? Why does it work when we set a goal? Why does it work when we come together as a team and we set a joint mission, we collaborate and we work together in a near harmony to try to achieve something that we couldn't achieve on our own? It's these chemicals at work, these primal chemicals from way back in the days of survival that are actually in play today, even in a time of austerity, prosperity, and the fact that we don't have to worry about food, but the very primal things that prompted us to go look for food are things that are prompting us to go achieve goals. So it's very, very interesting on how all this comes together.
Well, let's take those examples and then let's talk about that later again. So we come up with our framework, our business framework, and then we don't see the results fast enough. And what do we want to do? We switch.
Yeah.
And do we switch because it's having a negative impact, or we switch because it's not going forward fast enough, or we just haven't even given it enough time? And so that brings it kind of back to cortisol, and I want to cover that a little more because that defense system was great for survival. What we're able to do with our prefrontal cortex is take physical needs that were, again, the reproduction, safety, food, and replace them in a social setting. And so we get that calm. We've implemented a new system. We start out a new year. It's a new year now. Everything is calm, and then we start looking around going, wow, what's going on? And again, that makes sense on the plains. If you're a deer, antelope, whatever, gazelle on the plain eating grass and everything is good, and you just stay in the mode of everything's good and don't look up and check your surroundings, you'll get eaten by a lion.
Eaten by the lion. There you go.
And so there is a natural reason to have that. In reality, we want to apply that to business frameworks, things that we have going on. And so Your relationship might be going well, business might be going well, and all of a sudden you get this bad feeling, like you're waiting. I heard someone say they're waiting on the 2 before to come and knock them in the
Back of the head, yeah. The other
that's
shoe to
that
drop.
feeling, another shoe to drop. That's what they're asking about. So that's one problem, is it may cause you to switch or abandon things that you have going on prematurely. So you need to think in your head, when that triggers, have a methodology to do a quick assessment. Are we still in alignment with what we believe? Are we aligned in the values we have? Are we aligned in the goal we have? Are we making progress towards that goal, or at least preparing to make progress towards that goal? Trigger that dopamine on that progress instead of just the goal. And then you can kind of shut that cortisol down, kick down, and say, all right, we're good. Another negative of cortisol is cynicism. And that, I would say, is the largest part of, again, this book that I think is really good, Science of Positivity. And so the real thesis there is when that problem is actually you. And so we talked about you or your organization as the problem.
Right.
And so we talked about humility. We've talked about
Know
reflection.
yourself, know your organization.
We've talked about sacrificing things that you're doing. Well, when you get that hit and you know that cortisol tells you that there is a problem, and then you look at that and you go, well, yeah, there's a problem, but look what the Fed rate just did. Look what my competitor just did. Look at Gen Z, millennials, whatever else. Look at XYZ leader. Our competitors are doing this and that. There may be validity to that, but what you're able to do is that turns off the alarm in your head that was saying you have a problem. Now you said they have a problem.
Correct.
And then the really bad thing you can do in that cycle is I can study up on it, and then I can call up Scott and we can have a conversation on, the new labor laws are really messing up, 1099s in California. Isn't that right, Scott? Yeah, that's right. That's right. So now what did I just do? One, I showed him how smart I was. So I got my serotonin hit.
Right.
So my cortisol's gone. I got a good serotonin hit. Then I just grouped up with Scott. So I got an oxytocin hit.
Yep, exactly right.
So now I'm feeling really good. Now we're going to go tell the rest of the team about how bad it is. And we're going to explain to everybody how bad all these outside cynical things are that we probably don't have control. Again, the ocean. And so then what do we get? We prepared a meeting. We're ready to go. We got dopamine because we made a movement towards doing something.
Yeah.
And so we're excited. So then what happens? We burn up all those nice chemicals. Cortisol hits again because you didn't fix the problem you had.
Yep.
And so then what do?
Start looking for another.
You find another. And so our brain is
another
able
way
to do this.
To stem the cortisol, which
I don't like that feeling. And so that alarm gets louder and louder and louder. And your body will demand a response.
Right.
And so cynicism is a way to set that off. And then the problem is if you continue to not self-reflect, not sacrifice something you're doing in the past that may have worked, that alarm will go off as soon as you burn up that cycle. What will also happen is you can get that cortisol hit that'll spin that cycle even faster. As we group up, and then Antonio that works with us, he gets in our group and he knows more than I do. Well, now all of a sudden my ranking just went down.
Right.
And so the other downside of why I think serotonin is not so much a always positive group feeling is when you see your status start to drop, then you want to pull out of the group because now you're worried the group doesn't like you anymore and you're the one that's not in charge anymore. So now you can pull out and you can say, well, that's the group's fault. And then guess what you can do? Now you can blame the group. Then you can find a new friend who can blame the group. And you can just play this game over and over and over again. And we see this a ton. We see it a lot. And so I will stray a little bit into society today when there's a new emergency, a new problem, a new catastrophe once a week. And you can go join the new group to raise the alarm bell, group up on it, tell everybody else how much you're doing on behalf of the new calls and how much they're not doing. You can raise your rank. You can get your dopamine. You can get your new group. That kind of flames out because you figure out that your problem still exists.
Right.
And then you need to go spin the cycle up again. So we do it in business all the time. What do? Let's be the boss that goes and, gets on scheduling, accounting, HR, whatever it is, because we had a bad performance at a client. Or maybe you brought on that client and you onboarded them with a bad scope of work. You didn't build out the project properly. Well, I'll tell you what we can do. Let's go blame the people that executed the project.
Right.
And if that doesn't work, we'll blame the client. And sometimes it's accurate. So I want to be clear that those triggers are useful in raising the alarm so that you go search for the problem. What is not useful is when you get in the cynicism cycle of you refuse to look at yourself, or you raise an alarm that is a false alarm and you start taking action that you don't need to take because you hadn't actually allowed your team to adopt a habit. And you've done a lot of research on how many times it takes to develop a habit.
Sure.
You certainly are trained and certified in change management, ADCAR, the amount of time it takes to actually implement something going forward. And so we get in a little bit of a habit of we'll just rapid fire. And so certainly you have seen coworkers and leaders that the next new thing, and they're just bam, 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 bam. And rapid fire is, maybe they got that hit and it wasn't quite going as fast as they thought, or things were going fine. It just wasn't, in their control, or maybe someone else took the lead and they kind of went down in ranking. So I bring these up, largely just to, the defense against them is really awareness. And so the offense to make them better is certainly a topic we can spend some time on, but would take a while. And Huberman does an excellent job. We will certainly do a discussion on gratitude, love, faith,
Sure.
hope, and optimism are great defenses against all these. And that's actually, if you read the positive psychology book, that's basically what it boils down to. Certainly, we've done a lot of reading here on the Stoics. You actually read the Stoics and kind of their way of reframing the world and obstacles and whether things are good or bad are a lot to gratitude, hope, finding wills and ways, and optimism that you can, whatever problem you have is not a permanent problem and you can find ways to get around it. And so the mind trick they play actually does play at a chemical level, and it is positive in that way. So,
Yes, I was thinking about it, Chan. I was going to ask I'm the operations person, so always want the answer, right? How do I make this? How do you put this in practice? How do I use this in my day to day? How do I help the team become more efficient, more effective, etc.? But then I realized that what we're here to do today is that first step of awareness. Because as we continue the podcast series, we'll talk about things and issues that captains and crews encounter. And as we talk about the steps and the tools and the methodologies that are out there to help them combat those situations or address those situations, we can now refer back to neurochemistry and say, right, so let's remember our neurochemistry and how may that be playing into this situation so that as we are evaluating and trying to make better decisions, we do it from a well-informed state. And I think that's what's so important about this particular session is this understanding, this foundation setting, this awareness of neurochemistry, because by understanding that, we'll be able to use it, understand it, and leverage it in some cases to the betterment of the organization.
yeah, I wrote out a few questions you can ask yourself when you go down this neurochemical kind of questionnaire, and it really is for awareness. But number one, you don't need to become a neuroscientist, but I do think that it is wise for you to have at least a flashcard knowledge of the main chemicals, what triggers them, and kind of the attributes of kind of how you respond to them. So first question is, what neurochemical is likely working in your brain? Why do I feel this way? Second one is, how does it impact your emotions, your thinking, and actions? And so if you go back to, again, is it a ranking? You feel like you dropped in a ranking? Are you pursuing something for a good purpose? Or is it you feel like you're getting left out of a group? Or does it feel like you're not making progress towards your goal? In that order, that would be serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine. So how does it generally manifest in your brain? And then next, is that chemical response appropriate for the given situation? Again, it works. So don't confuse what I'm saying. It works to benefit the evolution of the species. It works in nature. It works often in society, and we're transferring these over into social situations, sometimes to the detriment, but you need to make sure, is it appropriate for the situation? And so next is the situation itself correctly identified? And so what I mean by that is, did you substitute in a distraction? So did you substitute in a cynical, take that self-reflection. Did you substitute that in? Next is, did you substitute the purpose? So you started out with a good goal. When we go back to our metaphor helm-wise, if you set a waypoint that's your next waypoint, you kind of went this way because the ocean was a little smoother. So I'm just going to keep going this way. So make sure you're back on line to where you're trying to go.
Orient
yourself back up. So you got to get that and align your group back on it. Next one we spoke about earlier is the example of doing great charity work. Trying to be an outreach person, something we are, really based our whole why around is multiplying blessings. Certainly that goes out into philanthropy is, have you perverted the why and the purpose for selfish reasons? So now it's about you, not about the team, not about the company, not about the calls, not about the need of others. You have swapped it out, and now it's your narcissism or your sociopathic or your fear, which is one I credit a lot of this to, is fear of wanting to actually self-reflect. And then lastly, which we haven't spent much time on this section, at least there's a couple more options, so I shouldn't say lastly, but is it a natural droop? So these chemicals actually burn up pretty fast in your brain. That high doesn't last long. That cycle is pain versus pleasure, pain versus pleasure. You enter a group, that's a great feeling. You've been in the group a while, you get back together, it's not as great of a feeling. That's a natural. That does not mean something's wrong with the group. Now, maybe you need to go with new adventures. Maybe you need to come up with those reward systems that make the grouping exciting again, but it's not a negative. That's a natural droop. And so same thing with ranking. You did something great. You had an accomplishment. You're number one on the team. Well, we like to give recognition around here. We call it random recognition. And so one of the things we like to do is when they exhibit a behavior that is going towards one of our values. So they might not be one of the big important things on that is you don't have to get the number one star. You get the person who's showing that spark, that drive towards it. Well, if their immediate response is they feel good because they got that serotonin, they rose the ranks, we celebrated them. Well, they need to understand that will fade away. That doesn't mean they're less of a person or they're not still valuable. That's the natural droop that I'm talking about, even in serotonin. So that comes along. Fifth thing is, should you override the chemical's tendency?
Ooh.
So this is where you have to use your prefrontal cortex, and you need to decide. And again, I think that in your heart whether your pursuit is worthy and whether you're doing it the right way. And so I do think in your heart is not enough. I do think you need to put them, again, out as values and a purpose so that others can hold you accountable to it. But when your tendency starts interfering with something that is the right way to do it, is it the right way to steal someone else's glory? Is it always the right way to show you're the best? Is it better sometimes to pass the ball as opposed to be the number one every single time, has to score? You have to make that decision. And so, of course, certainly there's people watching. There's evolutionary reason why people group and give other rewards, but it is interesting that if you dominate all the time, you will likely not lead for very long. And you might lead all the way to success in business, but you'll always be watching your back because everyone's gunning for taking you down. And so overriding it, you have the ability to take that natural tendency and decide that you want to redirect it. But I think that'll be hard to do if you don't understand the chemicals that are at play.
You wouldn't even know to redirect because you didn't know.
Exactly. It's just me. That's what people say. That's just how I am.
Yeah.
Well, that's just how animals are.
I think I said that this morning.
Yeah, well, I've had some very blunt discussions, which is you haven't figured out on the podcast. It's pretty normal for me. But are you more than an animal? That's really the question. And so understand that may be your predisposition. What are you going to do about it? And that's my last one. Should you deploy a counter defensive? So what's your countermeasure? And so countermeasure to that we talked about was that really start learning what we call clinical definitions of gratitude, love, faith, hope, and optimism. read up on it. You'll see how it can extend some of your highs, can soften some of your, your drops, and maybe take that trough, a little hit out of that trough. Also can really help you build your own, raise all your level. A good gratitude practice can raise all three of those big chemicals we just mentioned. It can raise dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, can raise it to the level that pharmaceuticals and exercise can. So a good gratitude practice, which we'll cover and later on sessions, will help with that. A methodology. So this is where one you'll definitely like, Scott, is a discipline. Get a methodology to quickly walk through what you're feeling. And so at Helmwise, we have laid out some what we call infinity loops, which are just a constant circle back through that we've spoken about of, I've mentioned it a bunch today, but not just your values, your why, your purpose, kind of that self-examination of your humility and self-reflection. Then go over and take a quick look at, is this productive towards my career, my business, the family I want to have, the friendships I want to have, and discipline yourself on that. But you can get in that habit of, let's take just a quick, I've been triggered, quick survey. What's going on? Quick survey. Am I in alignment with all those? Am I in alignment with what I wanted to do in this business setting, in what we said was a great relationship?
Right.
Is it in within the relationship with your children? And so that's, again, why we spend so much time on purpose, because how do you know if it's the way you wanted your marriage to be, the way you wanted your friendship to be, if you haven't set out the expectations? And so, but develop a methodology to quickly go through it is really the way to look at those.
Love methodologies. That's always good. Chandler, that piece of what you just went over was gold. It really was, because I think of all the background that you set, you laid in some good examples, but then you kind of broke it down into how do you practically use this information. Do you have those written down where you can just go through those steps again, just so that we can reinforce with
I do. So
our viewers or listeners?
Yep, certainly. Identify the chemical. So
Okay.
it needs a baseline understanding. They're not a bunch of them. And again, get them at kind of a flashcard level of knowledge. Understand the impact should be on that to your emotions, your thinking, and your actions. Take an assessment, which we talked about the methodology of, is that chemical appropriate for the situation? So when you get that hit that's good in the survival of the kind of more ancient world, now you're in a social setting. Is this appropriate? Or are you just triggering something that is, you don't need to outdo every male in the room to get a mate anymore, because we're not in nature with clubs. Like we have social settings, we have social media, we have online dating, we have a million ways to find it. So you can kind of look at that. Is the situation correctly identified? So again, did you substitute it with cynicism? Is it in alignment with your why and purpose? Have you perverted the why and purpose? So you kind of co-opted it for your own, feeling of superiority or happiness. And so you're no longer actually going together with what you are aligned, supposedly aligned and rallying around. And then is it just a natural droop? So that hit comes with a downside. That's inevitable. And so look at that. Do you need to override it? Again, that's
Right.
back to the social setting. And then can you deploy that counter defensive? And that is the gratitude, love, faith, hope, and optimism. We'll cover that. It is very important, because if you go Googling it, feel free. A lot of what's out there is happy psychology. Again, Huberman has jumped on the gratitude side. There is a lot of information on what we call realistic, more of a clinical definition of those items, but they are important. And then the methodology of just take that assessment quickly.
Absolutely. So don't use Chat GPT in this particular case.
It may be useful. I haven't actually checked it.
Well, I think you would
see
have
how
to.
how it plays out,
Yes.
but I would.
I think your prompt or query would have to say in accordance with,
Well, even that's hard to do.
Huberman
So
or
I
some
think
of
that
the
if
others.
you there's a short clip with Joe Rogan and Huberman that you all can look up, that he asked one of the biggest surprises since he started his podcast, and it was when he went back and revisited the actual data studies and summarized up to 2021 the info on gratitude. And so it
There you go.
didn't discredit all of what was out there, but it showed there was a much more potent and potentially useful way to express gratitude, that if you went and just went down what you found on Google, you would have a hard time getting it. So some hard research is important in these areas because it gets a little too much into rainbows and puppy dogs and those type of things. So
an information dense session today, Chandler. Anything you want to do before we wrap? Any other pieces you want to put a bow around when it comes to these 4 chemicals? Because I'm putting cortisol in there as well.
No, cortisol is important and certainly is necessary. And so again, that's the alarm bell that your body will make you respond to. And your brain can substitute. And so it is one to watch out for. But overall, they're amazing. They work really well. I mean, you need to appreciate how they worked well to evolve human beings and civilization, society, and then how, as we become more modern world, they can become twisted and we can find ways to manifest items that aren't there. And so that's just how our brains work, and we need to find a way to point them towards something useful, a good cause with some good values, understand when they are manipulating us and we're not manipulating them.
Excellent. So that's going to do it for today. We want to thank our listeners or viewers for joining us on podcast number 6 of the Powerhouse Perspective. A very information but dense, but also very, very important session today with Chandler. And please join us for our next session where we'll start applying some of this neurochemistry as we make better decisions on our journey as a Helmwise captain.